Imagine walking the halls of Versailles, a king completely smitten, and a woman so powerful. Uh, she basically ran the place for like 20 years.
20 years.
We're going deep on Madame de Pompadour today, the woman who totally captivated King Louis the Kick-Fifth for 2 decades.
You know her name from that hairstyle.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But she was way more than just a trendsetter.
Oh, definitely.
She was a total player in the world of politics, a huge supporter of the arts, and knew how to handle the French court like nobody's business.
Like, seriously, the French court was not a joke.
Right.
So today we've got biographies, firsthand accounts, and analyses of what life was like back then, and it's all about painting a picture of this woman who broke all the rules and, like, changed history forever.
Changed history?
We're going to uncover, like, all the layers of this incredible woman. From her, normal upbringing to how she became so powerful, and then how she, like, changed French culture, and even stuff beyond that.
So let's start with how she got to Versailles.
Right.
She was born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, not exactly like royalty.
Yeah, true. Her family was well off, but her dad was a financier who got into some shady stuff and had to leave the country.
Oh, wow.
But her mother knew how to make friends with the right people.
That's key.
So young Jean got a killer education, music, dancing, art, you name it.
And legend says a fortune teller predicted she'd like charm a king someday.
Seriously.
And her family even called her Rionette, which means little queen, foreshadowing much.
Oh, that's too good. It's like a real-life fairy tale. But it wasn't just fate Madame de Pompadour. She was seriously strategic.
Strategic how?
She married this guy who was totally in love with her, but he also had this hunting lodge,
Okay.
And it just happened to be super close to the king's favorite hunting spot.
How convenient.
Convenient, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just about love. She wanted to be where the power was.
Makes sense.
And she made sure the king noticed her.
Like how?
Picture this bright pink dress, blue carriage driving right past the king. Bold, right? But she was more than just a pretty face. Their first encounter was at a masked ball, and it showed off her brains big time.
Masked ball? Those were so cool.
Right. So the king was disguised as a yew tree.
Oh, a yew tree?
A tree. You heard me, right? And she, playing off their hunting lodge run-ins, she went as Diana the Huntress.
So smart.
Right? Showing off her beauty and her cleverness.
But becoming the official mistress, the maîtresse en titre, was way bigger than just romance.
What do you mean?
It was like a super official role in the French court with its own, like, rules and responsibilities.
You're telling me there was a job description for a royal mistress?
Pretty much. The queen was mostly for show, producing heirs.
Right.
The mistress was for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and, yeah, the physical stuff, too.
So basically, Madame de Pompadour became Louis XV's confidant, his intellectual equal, like everything the queen wasn't.
You got it. And she took that role way beyond the bedroom.
Seriously?
She started a theater at Versailles.
A whole theater.
She became a huge supporter of the arts and helped people like Voltaire and Diderot become stars.
She founded a whole theater. That's major influence.
Big time. She was passionate about French craftsmanship. She promoted Sèvres porcelain. She basically set all the fashion trends. We all know about the pompadour hairstyle, but that's just the tip of the iceberg.
That's crazy to me. You're telling me she's throwing these fancy parties and influencing fashion while regular people are struggling to get food? How did people feel about her extravagance, especially when times were tough?
That's a really good point. Her patronage, which was huge, happened when things were getting really tense socially.
Yeah.
People were struggling, and then they saw the lavishness of the court and her theater, and they weren't happy.
So she kind of represented both the brilliance and the problems of the French court, like a symbol of the tension that was bubbling under the surface.
Exactly. And speaking of complicated relationships, let's talk about her and the queen, Marie Lagisca. It wasn't the rivalry you'd expect.
Okay, got to hear this. How did the queen react to Madame de Pompadour knowing her position was, well, a little compromised?
This is where you see Madame de Pompadour's emotional intelligence. She really wanted the queen's approval, so she showered her with gifts and invitations to her theater.
Wow.
Their first meeting was actually pretty friendly. The queen asked about a friend they both knew.
Really?
Yep, and that one little gesture earned Madame de Pompadour's loyalty for life.
Wow. So instead of fighting, she created a bond like an alliance.
Right.
Fascinating. But did the queen really accept Madame de Pompadour, or was she just being smart?
It's hard to say. Some sources say the queen preferred Madame de Pompadour's discretion and kindness compared to the king's previous mistresses who were openly disrespectful.
Interesting.
Maybe she knew it was unavoidable and chose to keep the peace.
It just shows that history is never black and white. Even in a place as strict as the French court, people were complicated.
Absolutely. And this is so different from how Marie Antoinette later treated Madame de Berry, Louis XV's next mistress.
Oh, yeah, I remember her.
Totally icy between them. Seems like Madame de Pompadour's approach worked better, at least in that situation.
Maybe Marie Antoinette could have learned something from Madame de Pompadour's diplomacy. But our pretty prime minister, she had her own challenges, right? Her relationship with Louis XV, it changed over time, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Their passionate phase, which was pretty intense, let's just say.
Okay.
It eventually turned into more of a platonic friendship. This happened around the same time the king started looking for other, shall we say, distractions.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall at Versailles.
Yeah.
How did she handle that shift in their relationship? Did she try to get back that initial spark?
She was actually super pragmatic about it. Sources say she recognized the king's need for what they called young things. She even said that a young, inexperienced woman wouldn't be a threat to her position.
So she knew her influence was more than just physical.
Exactly. She focused on nurturing their intellectual and emotional connection. They
Well,
had intimate dinners, they'd talk about art and philosophy, they even bonded over their shared love of coffee. Louis XV would actually brew it for her personally.
that's kind of sweet.
Mm-hmm.
There was a real connection between them, right? Something that went beyond their roles.
Their story makes you think about the complexity of human relationships, even in a place like a royal court. But their time together was limited, as we know.
And on that note, we'll dive into Madame de Pompadour's later years with all the personal and political challenges after a quick word from our sponsors.
Oh.
Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back. We were just talking about how Madame de Pompadour's relationship with King Louis XV's changed over time. It's so interesting how she stayed influential even when things cooled down romantically. But let's not forget about all the political craziness happening in Europe back then. This is where Madame de Pompadour steps onto the world stage. She gets mixed up in a conflict that changes everything, the 7 Years' War.
The 7 Years' War is so complicated. Battles everywhere from Europe to North America and India.
Global.
Historians still argue about her exact role, but it's clear Madame de Pompadour was super important in French foreign policy at the time. Our sources say she helped create a super important alliance between France and Austria. I think I remember this. Didn't she really dislike the Prussians?
You're right, Frederick the Great of Prussia. He was witty, but also really sarcastic.
Oh, yeah.
He started calling his dog Pompadour.
No way.
Not very diplomatic.
Can you imagine the gossip at Versailles? But seriously, this alliance with Austria was a big risk for France, wasn't it?
Huge gamble. And it had some serious consequences.
How?
France was already having money problems, and the war just made everything worse. A lot of people blamed Madame de Pompadour for the debt and the losses.
She became the scapegoat for everything. That must have been so hard, especially with her health problems.
Exactly. She struggled with chronic bronchitis her whole life.
Right.
The stress of court life and the war probably made it way worse.
Plus, let's be real, keeping up with Louis XV's lifestyle couldn't have been easy, even without being sick.
There are stories about her trying everything to stay attractive and keep the king happy. Some sources even say she tried a crazy diet. Celery truffles and vanilla.
Celery truffles and vanilla. That's an interesting combo. Did it work?
Thankfully, a friend told her to stop. It was dangerous. Luckily, she started exercising, which seems to have helped more.
Wow, she tried to control everything, from her diet to politics. It shows how ambitious and tough she was.
Yeah,
But maybe also a little desperate to hold on to her position.
good point. And remember, all this is happening while her relationship with the king is changing. We talked about the shift from passion to friendship. But how did she deal with Louis XV's, distractions?
It's hard to imagine being in that situation, especially in a place like Versailles, with all its rules and traditions.
Madame de Pompadour handled it with her usual practicality. Sources say she understood the king's need for what they called young things.
Oh, wow.
She even said a young, inexperienced woman wouldn't threaten her position.
So she knew her power was more than just physical.
Exactly. She focused on their intellectual and emotional bond.
Like how?
They still had those private dinners, talked about art and philosophy, even bonded over coffee.
It's kind of heartwarming. A real connection despite everything.
It reminds us that even in a formal place like Versailles, relationships could be complicated and real. But as we know, all stories, even those with palaces and power, have to end.
And sadly for Madame de Pompadour, it ended way too soon. At just 42, she died from pneumonia. She left behind a legacy as complex as she was.
Her death wasn't a total surprise because of her health, but it really affected Louis V.
I can imagine, especially after all those years together. How did he react? He was known for being pretty reserved.
Public displays of grief weren't allowed at court, But sources say Louis V cried when she died. He said, "This is the only respect I'm allowed to pay her."
That's so sad. Even with all the court rules, his sadness comes through.
It shows that behind the titles and power, they were real people with real feelings. And even after her death, Madame de Pompadour's story continued. Her influence went way beyond her time at Versailles.
And on that note, we'll explore Madame de Pompadour's lasting legacy, the pretty prime minister who changed French culture, and so much more after a quick break. Stay with us. Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking all about Madame de Pompadour. From her, strategic marriage to becoming the king's BFF, her impact on art and politics, and even those complicated relationships with the queen and, of course, Louis XV. But what about her legacy? Like, how is she remembered today? Besides that hairstyle.
That's the thing. Her influence goes way beyond a fashion trend. She basically shaped the whole Rococo period.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. It was a shift from that heavy Baroque style to something lighter, more fun, more delicate, pastels, especially pink, intricate details. It was all about celebrating beauty and pleasure.
So when I see those super fancy Sèvres porcelain pieces or like a room decorated in that Rococo style, that's Madame de Pompadour's influence.
Exactly. She supported so many artists and artisans that she helped define a whole era. Her impact on French art, fashion design is huge, but it goes even deeper than that. She changed what it meant to be a royal mistress back then.
We talked about how she went beyond just, the usual expectations. She was a patron of the arts. She even had a say in political decisions.
Exactly. She showed that women could have real power and influence just by being smart, charming, and strategic. Think about it. She was behind a major European alliance. She championed Enlightenment ideas. She basically dictated taste for a whole artistic movement. And she did all of this while navigating a court that was totally dominated by men.
It's amazing all the barriers she broke, all the expectations she defied. She was a total trailblazer.
Absolutely. And her story is still relevant today, especially now when we're talking about women and power and influence and agency. Madame de Pompadour's life is like a case study. It shows how women throughout history have found ways to be powerful even when the system was against them.
It makes you wonder what she could have done if she was born in a different time with different opportunities. Would she have been even more influential? Or was being the king's mistress with all the drama and challenges, was that the thing that let her break those barriers?
Such a good question. On one hand, she might have thrived in a more equal society where she could focus on her intellectual and artistic passions without all the court stuff.
Yeah.
But maybe being an outsider, always having to prove herself, maybe that's what drove her ambition.
It's like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Maybe those limitations, those challenges, made her into the amazing woman she became.
And her story reminds us that history is full of complicated people, people who don't fit into neat little boxes. Madame de Pompadour was ambitious, strategic, definitely controversial, but she was also brilliant, resilient, and she loved beauty and knowledge.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how powerful her story is. It reminds us that even when things seem impossible, you can make your own path, break the rules, and leave your mark on the world.
She makes us question simple labels and easy answers. Madame de Pompadour was so much more than just a pretty face at court. She was a woman of substance, a force to be reckoned with, and her story deserves to be remembered and explored in all its complexity.
So as we say goodbye to Madame de Pompadour, I'm left with a sense of wonder and a ton of questions. What parts of her story resonated with you? What would you ask her if you could go back in time? We want to hear your thoughts. Share them with us on social media. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that matter. Until next time.